Okay, so you've given us a lot to unpack this time. It looks like a really fascinating deep dive into, well, the whole world of addiction. The neuropsychology, the impact. Uh, I mean, it seems like you went for a pretty comprehensive view with these sources, huh?
Yeah, it is a deep dive. And I think, it's one of those topics that really deserves that deep dive, right? It's a challenge that affects so many people, both directly and indirectly. It's certainly got implications for individuals, families, communities. I mean, the whole of society, really.
Yeah, for sure. So what we're going to try to do today is really break down what addiction actually is, how widespread it is, not just globally, but also closer to home. Like, how does it show up in our own communities?
Yeah.
And then I guess the big one, the real meat of it, is the biology and the psychology behind it all. What are the forces at play that actually drive addiction?
That's it. That's the core of it. We'll be looking at the brain, of course, those intricate neural circuits and the changes that happen. But we'll also zoom out to consider those broader social and environmental factors that really can't be ignored.
Right, right. Because I'm seeing here in the notes that it's not just about individual choices, right? There's this whole interplay of biology, psychology, and social context. So our mission then, I guess, is to distill all this information, these dense research articles and reports, into something, digestible and understandable. We want to arm you, the listener, with a clear picture of what addiction is and how it works.
Absolutely. And I think what's really interesting about these sources in particular is that we're kind of approaching this topic through an AI lens. It's that systematic and comprehensive approach that AI is known for. And I think that's going to give us a really unique angle.
Cool. Yeah, a unique angle. I like that. All right, so let's dive right in, shall we? And the first thing that jumps out just looking at this material is that we're talking about way more than just substance abuse, right? Addiction as a concept has really broadened.
It has, and I think that's really crucial to acknowledge right from the start. We're not just talking about drugs and alcohol. Addiction is now defined as a chronic relapsing disorder. And what really defines it is this compulsive engagement with substances or behaviors, despite knowing that they're causing harm.
So it's that drive, that inability to stop, even when it's clear things are going wrong.
It's a really powerful drive. And it's important to emphasize that this isn't just a lack of willpower. Addiction is recognized as both a brain disorder and a mental illness.
A double whammy.
Yeah, pretty much. It actually involves long-lasting changes in the brain. And we're talking about changes in the very structure and function of those circuits that are essential for how we experience reward, how we respond to stress, how we learn, how we form memories, make decisions, and even our capacity for self-control.
Whoa. That's pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah.
So it's literally rewiring the brain.
You could say that. And these changes can be really persistent. They can actually stick around long after someone stops using the substance or engaging in the behavior. And that really highlights why addiction is often so chronic and why relapse is such a huge challenge.
I'm starting to see why this is such a complex issue to tackle.
It is. And the complexity is increased even further when we consider that, for substances at least, there's a whole spectrum of severity when it comes to substance use disorders, or SUDs as they're called. It's not just black and white. There are shades of gray in between.
Right, because not everyone who uses a substance is automatically addicted.
Exactly. The DSM-5, which is like the diagnostic Bible for mental health professionals, it outlines a range of SUDs from mild to severe, and this severity is determined by the number of specific diagnostic criteria that a person meets.
So like a checklist of symptoms.
Sort of. It helps clinicians to understand, where on the spectrum someone falls and to tailor treatment accordingly.
Got it. So we've established that addiction is a chronic brain disorder and a mental illness. It involves these lasting changes in the brain, and there's this spectrum of severity. But we also mentioned earlier that addiction now encompasses way more than just substances. It's about behaviors too, right?
Exactly. And this is a relatively new frontier in our understanding of addiction. We now recognize what are called behavioral addictions or process addictions. And these include a whole range of activities that don't involve ingesting a substance.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Well, think about gambling, excessive internet use, gaming, social media, shopping, work.
Workaholism.
Yep, that's one. Even things like food, sex, exercise, and even relationships or certain ideologies can become addictive.
Whoa, hold on. Relationships and ideologies, how can those be addictive?
It's a bit more nuanced, but basically it's when someone becomes so fixated on a certain relationship or belief system that it starts to dominate their life, and they engage in harmful behaviors to maintain it. But that's a whole other conversation. The point is that the scope of addiction has really broadened.
It sounds like we need a whole separate deep dive just on that.
We probably do. But for now, let's focus on what these seemingly diverse things, substance addictions and behavioral addictions, have in common. What are the common threads that tie them together?
Yeah, good question.
Mhm.
Because on the surface, they seem so different.
They do. But the source material points out that both SUDs and these behavioral addictions share some really core features. And it's these shared features that really define them as addictions. There's a loss of control over the behavior, so you can't just stop even if you want to.
So you're not in the driver's seat anymore.
Exactly. And then there's this persistent preoccupation with the substance or the activity. It takes up a lot of mental space.
Always thinking about it.
Yep. And then there's the development of tolerance. So you need more and more to get the same effect,
Chasing that initial high.
which unfortunately you never quite get. And then when you try to stop or cut back, you experience withdrawal symptoms.
Which can be physical or psychological, right?
Exactly. For substance addictions, the physical symptoms are often more obvious: nausea, tremors, sweating, things like that. But for behavioral addictions, the withdrawal symptoms tend to be more psychological: anxiety, irritability, depression.
Not fun.
Not fun at all. And then, of course, a hallmark of addiction is that people continue the behavior despite the negative consequences.
Even when it's clearly hurting them.
Exactly. And all of this is capped off by a high risk of relapse. Even if you manage to quit, you're vulnerable to falling back into the old patterns.
Paints a pretty grim picture, huh? But what's really fascinating is that we're starting to understand the neurobiology behind all of this. And it seems like both substance use and addictive behaviors can trigger the brain's reward system in very similar ways. We're talking about those dopamine pathways.
That's right. And that suggests that there could be a common underlying mechanism at play.
Interesting. But it's also interesting that right now, gambling disorder is the only behavioral addiction that's officially recognized in the DSM-5. Things like internet gaming disorder are still under investigation.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it really reflects the fact that our understanding of behavioral addictions is still evolving. There's a lot more research that needs to be done. But the fact that gambling disorder is recognized speaks volumes about how seriously we're starting to take behavioral addictions.
Okay, so we've got a good overview of the shared features, but let's unpack those DSM-5 criteria for SUDs a little bit more, because it seems like they're pretty specific about what actually constitutes a disorder.
They are, and it's really helpful to understand these criteria because it helps us to recognize the signs and to understand the different ways SUDs can manifest.
Great. So walk us through them.
Okay, so the first category of criteria is what's called impaired control. And this basically gets at the idea that someone is unable to regulate their use of the substance. So this includes things like taking more of the substance than intended, using it for longer periods than planned, making unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control use.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, pretty classic signs. And then, of course, there's craving, that intense desire or urge to use the substance. And craving can be incredibly powerful. It can feel almost impossible to resist.
So it's not just about, enjoying the substance. It's about that overpowering urge.
Exactly. And it's that overpowering urge that really starts to define addiction. The next category of criteria is social impairment. And this is all about how substance use starts to impact a person's life, their relationships and their responsibilities.
So like neglecting work or school.
Yeah, that's a common one. So the criteria include things like repeatedly failing to fulfill major obligations at work, school, or home because of substance use, continuing to use despite social or interpersonal problems that are caused or worsened by the substance.
So even though they know it's creating problems in their relationships, they keep using.
Sadly, yes. And then there's giving up important social, occupational, or recreational activities because of substance use. So it starts to take over their life, and they start to withdraw from things they used to enjoy.
So their whole world starts to shrink.
Yeah, pretty much. The next category is risky use. And this one's pretty straightforward. It's about using the substance in physically hazardous situations, like driving under the influence, for example.
Not smart.
Definitely not. Or continuing to use even though they know they have a physical or psychological problem that's probably caused or worsened by the substance. So it's like ignoring the warning signs from your body and your mind.
Like turning a blind eye to the damage it's doing.
Exactly. And then the last category of criteria is pharmacological criteria. And this is all about the body's physical response to the substance. So this includes tolerance, which we already talked about, needing more and more to get the same effect on withdrawal, experiencing those characteristic physical and psychological symptoms when you stop or reduce your use. And sometimes people even use the substance again just to relieve or avoid those withdrawal symptoms.
So it's a vicious cycle.
Totally. So you can see how comprehensive these criteria are, and depending on how many of these criteria someone meets, their SUD is classified as mild, moderate, or severe. So it's not just about whether someone has a problem or not, it's about the extent of the problem.
It's about how significantly it's impacting their life, really.
Exactly. And it's worth noting that there's been a real shift in how we talk about addiction. We're moving away from terms like abuse and addict, which are really stigmatizing and can make people feel ashamed or reluctant to seek help.
Yeah, I've noticed that shift.
It's a really important evolution. The emphasis now is on using person-first language and talking about substance use disorder. This helps to emphasize the medical nature of the condition.
Right, because it is a medical condition.
It is. It's a disorder, just like any other health condition. And there's also a distinction being made between misuse and addiction. Misuse is generally any use of a substance that's harmful or deviates from medical guidelines. It can be a one-time thing or an occasional thing. Whereas addiction usually refers to a more severe and chronic pattern of substance use that meets those DSM-5 criteria for SUD.
So it's about the severity and the persistence of the behavior.
Exactly. And this all points toward a more unified understanding of addiction, regardless of whether it involves a substance or a behavior.
So we're starting to see the bigger picture here.
We are. The source material really emphasizes the potential for this unified view. And the idea is that the core vulnerability might not be about the specific substance or behavior itself.
But something more fundamental.
Yeah. It might be about how our brains are wired, specifically those reward systems, learning mechanisms, and our capacity for self-control. The mechanisms involving how we learn through reinforcement, how behaviors become habits, and how our executive control gets impaired, those seem to be common threads across different types of addiction.
So it's about the interplay of our biology and our psychology.
Precisely. And it's so interesting to think about how we've arrived at this understanding, because the diagnostic criteria for addiction have really evolved over time.
Yeah, the source material has a really interesting historical overview.
It does. It talks about how addiction was initially viewed as a moral failing or a weakness of character.
Like a personal flaw.
Exactly. And then with later diagnostic systems like the DSM-3, there was more of an emphasis on physiological dependence. So the focus was on the presence of tolerance and withdrawal.
It became more medicalized.
It did. But now, with the DSM-5, we have this much broader set of criteria that really captures the complexity of addiction. It looks at multiple aspects of a person's life and acknowledges the intricate biological and behavioral components.
So it's become a much more nuanced and comprehensive understanding.
Absolutely. And it's moved away from those simplistic and judgmental explanations that were so prevalent in the past.
Which is a good thing.
Definitely. Okay, so we've got a pretty solid grasp of what addiction is, but now let's shift gears and talk about how widespread it is. And it looks like we're talking about a truly global challenge.
It is a global challenge. The sources really drive home that point. It's a phenomenon that cuts across demographics, cultures, and even history. We find evidence of psychoactive substance use going back thousands of years in all corners of the world.
It's a part of the human experience, really.
Yeah. And it really highlights that vulnerability to addiction is kind of woven into our fabric as humans. And of course, the way it shows up and how common it is, that's influenced by social and environmental factors, which we'll get into later. But first, let's talk about the sheer impact. The global public health burden of SUDs is staggering.
It is. The source material gives some pretty sobering statistics. For example, alcohol use alone is linked to millions of deaths annually.
Millions.
Yes. And it's a contributing factor in over 200 different diseases and injuries. So the impact goes way beyond just the immediate effects of alcohol consumption. It has ripple effects throughout a person's life and throughout society.
Makes sense. And it's not just alcohol, right? What about illicit drugs?
They contribute significantly too. Especially in certain regions like North America, opioid-related deaths are a huge concern globally, making up a large proportion of all drug-related fatalities. And of course, the emergence of synthetic opioids like fentanyl, it's just fueled the fire. Overdose deaths have reached epidemic levels in many countries. It's a really critical issue.
It is. And the data from the United States from those national surveys on drug use and health, it's pretty concerning. What are those numbers again?
Well, the latest data shows that something like 48 million people aged 12 or older in the U.S. experienced a substance use disorder in the past year.
That's a lot of people.
It is. And of those, millions are specifically dealing with alcohol use disorder or drug use disorder. And many people are actually struggling with both. So we've got this huge number of people affected by SUDs. And while alcohol remains the most prevalent, that opioid crisis, especially with the rise of fentanyl, it presents a very real and very deadly threat.
Yeah, it's scary stuff. And looking at these numbers, it's clear that addiction doesn't affect everyone equally, right? There are certain groups that are hit harder than others.
Absolutely. Age, for example, is a big factor. Young adults, those aged 18 to 25, consistently have the highest rates of SUDs.
That's the peak partying age, right?
No. Yeah. And then it's followed by older adults and then adolescents. And one thing that's really important to remember is that the earlier someone starts using substances, especially during adolescence when their brain is still developing, the higher their risk of developing an addiction later in life.
So the teenage brain is particularly vulnerable.
It is. It's still developing, so it's more susceptible to the effects of substances and to the development of those addictive patterns.
So we've got age playing a role. What about gender? Are there differences there?
Yeah, generally men report higher rates of SUD overall compared to women. But there's an important caveat here. Once women start using substances, they might be just as likely as men to develop an addiction. And some research suggests that women might actually progress from initial use to dependence more quickly than men do.
So they're more susceptible once they start.
It seems that way. And while there's that general trend of higher rates in men, there can also be variations in specific patterns of substance use and addiction. For example, some studies show that young women might be more prone to problematic smartphone use or social media addiction.
Interesting. And it's sad to see that there are significant racial and ethnic disparities as well.
Unfortunately, yes. Certain groups bear a disproportionate burden of addiction. And this really underscores the role of social determinants of health. Things like socioeconomic status, exposure to trauma and discrimination, access to resources. All of these things influence a person's vulnerability to addiction. And it's not just about individual choices, it's about systemic factors that create these disparities.
Yeah, it's about the context in which people are living their lives. Can you give some specific examples of these disparities?
Sure. So the 2022 data showed that SUD rates ranged from about 9% among Asian individuals to a much higher 24% among American Indian or Alaska Native individuals. And the 2023 data shows that these disparities are ongoing. We also see higher rates of opioid misuse among several minority groups compared to Asian individuals. And these differences are likely rooted in a combination of factors: systemic inequities, historical trauma, different levels of exposure to risk factors. All of these things play a role.
So it's a complex interplay of factors.
It is. And then, of course, socioeconomic status and employment are linked to addiction as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Poverty and unemployment can create a lot of stress.
Exactly. And stress is a huge risk factor for addiction. So unsurprisingly, SUD rates are significantly higher among unemployed individuals and those with lower income levels. And there's also a strong connection between lower socioeconomic status during childhood and increased exposure to adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
ACEs are those really stressful or traumatic events that happen in childhood, right?
That's right. Things like abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, parental substance use. All of these things can have a lasting impact on a child's development.
And make them more vulnerable to addiction later in life.
Exactly. And then, of course, we can't forget about the huge problem of addiction within the criminal justice system. Rates of SUDs are incredibly high among people who are incarcerated.
It's a cycle, isn't it? Addiction leading to crime, crime leading to addiction.
It often is. Estimates suggest that over 60% of jail inmates and state prisoners meet the criteria for an SUD, and most incarcerated individuals have some history of substance use or were convicted of drug-related crimes. So it's a major issue within that system.
Definitely. So we've talked about these broad categories of who's more likely to be affected by addiction, but let's get a little more specific about the different substances. Alcohol is still incredibly widespread, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's still the most commonly used substance. We're talking about almost 140 million current users in the United States alone, and over 60 million binge drinkers. And around 10% of American adults actually meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder.
It's a big number. And marijuana use is also pretty high up there, right?
Yeah, it's the most commonly used illicit drug. We're seeing numbers that suggest over 50 million past year users. And studies have shown that around 30% of regular users might develop a marijuana use disorder. So even though it's becoming more normalized and legalized in many places, it's important to be aware of the potential risks.
For sure. And then we've got the opioid crisis, which just keep getting worse.
Sadly, yes, it's a major concern, and it's really fueled by the rise of fentanyl. Millions of people misuse opioids annually in the U.S., including prescription painkillers and heroin, and the fact that fentanyl is so potent, it just makes the risk of overdose so much higher.
It's a real tragedy, and I think people forget sometimes that nicotine addiction is still a major problem too.
Oh, definitely. Nicotine is highly addictive, and smoking-related illnesses are still the leading cause of preventable death. And it's not just cigarettes. We've got vaping and all these new nicotine delivery systems that are becoming increasingly popular, especially among young people.
Right. It seems like there's always a new challenge emerging.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered substance addictions pretty thoroughly. Now let's shift gears and talk about those behavioral addictions, those process addictions. And one thing that jumps out right away is that the prevalence estimates for these are all over the map. Why is that?
Yeah, that's a key point. Unlike SUDs, where we have those standardized diagnostic criteria and more established ways of tracking prevalence for behavioral addictions, it's a lot more variable. We're still trying to figure out how to define and measure these things.
So it's harder to get a clear picture.
Exactly. And for many of these behavioral addictions, the diagnostic criteria aren't even included in the DSM-5 yet. So the estimates we do have often come from self-report questionnaires, which aren't always reliable, and the samples used in these studies might not be representative of the general population. So there's a lot of room for error.
So take those numbers with a grain of salt.
Exactly. But even with those limitations, it's clear that behavioral addictions are a significant concern.
So what kind of numbers are we talking about?
Well, for gambling disorder, the estimates range from about 0.1% to 5.8% of the population. For internet addiction, estimates pre-pandemic were around 6 to 7%. But during and after COVID-19, some studies, especially those focusing on students, found rates as high as 20%.
Wow, that's a huge jump.
It is, and it really highlights how major events like a global pandemic can exacerbate those vulnerabilities.
Makes sense. What about things like smartphone addiction and gaming disorder?
For smartphone addiction, estimates are often between 27% and 48% globally, and it's not surprising, right? Smartphones are so ubiquitous these days. They're an integral part of our lives, so it's easy to see how they can become problematic for some people. And for gaming disorder, again, there's a wide range of estimates.
And social media addiction.
Yep. Another one with varying estimates and potentially higher rates among young women and in Eastern cultures. And then there are all those other behavioral addictions: compulsive buying, work addiction, exercise addiction, food addiction. For some of these, the prevalence seems to have increased during the pandemic as well.
It seems like the pandemic really had an impact on a lot of these behaviors.
It did. The isolation, the stress, the disruption to routines, all of these things can contribute to addictive patterns.
So even though there are challenges in getting accurate data on behavioral addictions, it's clear that they're a growing concern, especially in our increasingly digital world.
Absolutely. And what's really important to remember is that these disparities we've been talking about across different age groups, genders, racial and ethnic groups, socioeconomic backgrounds, it really highlights that addiction isn't just a matter of individual biology or psychology. Social determinants of health play a huge role.
Right. Addiction isn't just a personal failing. It's influenced by the environment.
Exactly. And this is something that often gets overlooked. The source material really emphasizes that vulnerability and outcomes are shaped by things like socioeconomic status, exposure to trauma, discrimination, access to resources. All of these things matter. And higher rates of addiction in marginalized communities often reflect systemic inequities and greater exposure to those chronic stressors that we talked about.
So it's about understanding the bigger picture.
It is. And the source material also points out that the lack of standardized definitions and validated assessment tools for many behavioral addictions makes it even more challenging to get a handle on how widespread they really are. Often those studies rely on self-report questionnaires from samples that might not be very representative of the general population. And of course, technology is constantly evolving, so by the time we develop a good measure for, say, internet addiction, the landscape has already changed. It's a moving target. The sources stress that we really need consensus on those criteria and more rigorous research to understand the true scope of these challenges.
Yeah, it's a complex picture for sure. But looking at that table in the source material, that summary of prevalence estimates, it really drives home just how much variability there is across different addiction types and populations. It's not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon.
Not at all. And I think that's a really important message to take away from this discussion about prevalence. We need to be cautious about interpreting those numbers, and we need to keep doing research to get a better understanding of the nuances of addiction.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've seen how widespread addiction is and how it affects different people in different ways. But now let's really delve into the nuts and bolts of it, the biology. And it seems like a lot of it boils down to how addiction hijacks the brain's reward pathways and those neurotransmitters that are responsible for pleasure, motivation, learning, all those good things.
Exactly. At its core, addiction really is a biological phenomenon. It involves those neural circuits that govern our reward system, our motivation, our learning and memory, how we respond to stress, and our ability to control ourselves. And these circuits are all interconnected, so changes in one area can have cascading effects on other areas.
Right. And it seems like the mesolimbic dopamine pathway, that reward circuit, is really at the heart of it all.
It is. This pathway starts in an area of the midbrain called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, and it projects to the nucleus accumbens, which is part of the basal ganglia.
And dopamine is the key player here.
Dopamine definitely plays a huge role, but its role is actually quite complex. Addictive substances and addictive behaviors, they all reliably trigger an increase in dopamine release in that nucleus accumbens.
So like a flood of dopamine.
You could say that. And this flood can happen directly, like when you take a stimulant, it can block the reuptake of dopamine, so it just hangs around in the synapse longer. Or it can happen indirectly, like with opioids, which inhibit those neurons that normally suppress dopamine release. So it's like taking the brakes off the dopamine system. The brain is clever, unfortunately not always in a good way. But anyway, this surge of dopamine, it's what's associated with those pleasurable or euphoric effects that people experience when they use substances or engage in those addictive behaviors. And that feeling of pleasure, it acts as a powerful reinforcement signal. It makes you want to do it again.
So it's like a positive feedback loop.
Exactly. You do something, it feels good, you want to do it again. And the faster that dopamine increases, the more intense that high it tends to be, and the stronger the reinforcement. So you can see how certain substances, especially those that are smoked or injected, can be particularly addictive because they hit the brain quickly. But dopamine isn't just about pleasure. It's also really crucial for motivation, learning, attention, and what we call incentive salience.
Incentive salience, what's that?
It's basically about how much we want something, how important it seems to us, and how much we're drawn to it. So dopamine helps to shape our desires and our goals. And in addiction, those desires and goals become increasingly focused on the substance or the behavior.
So it's not just about liking it, it's about wanting it and needing it.
Exactly. But here's where things get a little counterintuitive, because with chronic exposure to these dopamine surges, the brain actually tries to compensate.
Compensate? How so?
It tries to turn the volume down on that dopamine signal. You can think of it like a thermostat. When the room gets too hot, the thermostat kicks in to cool things down. Similarly, when the brain is constantly flooded with dopamine, it tries to reduce its sensitivity to those surges.
So it's trying to maintain balance.
Exactly. But this can actually lead to some pretty negative consequences. It can lead to a decrease in the amount of dopamine released in response to the substance itself. So you need more of it to get the same effect. And it can also lead to a decrease in the availability of those dopamine receptors, particularly the D2 receptors in this striatum.
What does that do?
This blunting of the reward system, it can contribute to tolerance, which we already talked about, and to something called anhedonia, which is basically a decreased ability to experience pleasure from those natural rewards that we used to enjoy. So things that used to bring you joy just don't have the same effect anymore.
So it's like the brain is becoming numb to pleasure.
In a way, yes. But here's the really interesting part. While the response to the substance itself might decrease, the dopamine system often becomes hypersensitive to cues that have become associated with that substance through conditioning. So encountering people, places, or even moods that you've come to associate with drug use, those things can trigger a really strong release of dopamine, especially in an area of the brain called the dorsal striatum. And this is what drives craving. It's like your brain has learned that those cues predict reward, and it's become hypervigilant to those cues.
So even just seeing a reminder of the substance can trigger those cravings.
Exactly. And that's why environmental triggers can be so powerful for people in recovery. They can just walk past a certain bar or smell a certain scent, and it can trigger those intense cravings and make it really hard to stay on track.
It makes sense now why relapse is such a challenge.
Yeah.
But it's not just dopamine, right? There are other neurotransmitters involved in addiction too.
Oh, absolutely. The source material really emphasizes the importance of glutamate, which is the brain's main excitatory neurotransmitter. It's crucial for synaptic plasticity. That's basically how the brain strengthens or weakens connections between neurons based on our experiences.
So it's how we learn and form memories.
Exactly. And this includes learning and forming memories related to substance use and addictive behaviors. So chronic substance use, it actually leads to these maladaptive changes in glutamate signaling in those circuits connecting the prefrontal cortex, the striatum, and the thalamus. And these changes, they can really strengthen those drug-associated memories. It's like those memories become etched into the brain.
Making it harder to forget those experiences and move on.
Exactly, and they contribute significantly to that vulnerability to relapse. And then we have GABA, which is the brain's main inhibitory neurotransmitter.
So the one that chills things out.
Yep. And GABA normally helps to regulate dopamine release in the reward pathway. But a lot of addictive substances like alcohol, benzodiazepines, opioids, they directly affect GABAergic transmission.
So they interfere with that inhibitory system.
They do. And over time, the GABA system also goes through these neuroadaptations. It's like it tries to adjust to the presence of the substance. But this can lead to things like tolerance, withdrawal symptoms like anxiety and agitation, and just an overall imbalance between excitation and inhibition in the brain.
And the nature of change.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for joining us. And until next time, keep those sources coming.
This is DigitView.